Hey, howdy, hey! And welcome to my presentation about Death Note and the way that it portrays justice in Japan. I'm Phineas, otherwise known on YouTube as the one and only Phineas. So, let's get into this, shall we? Wait, that's a click. Oopsies. So my main question that I've had throughout the course that I've been taking with this is how does the anime Death Note reflect on Japan's attitudes about justice? I think it's really interesting to examine because it's an anime that tackles justice right at its forefront and represents its culture's landscape because of its state in being a product of the culture. So, when I was starting this presentation, I had to gather some sources and some knowledge. And I'm going to early in show you the sources that I've been using to make my points and what I'll be using throughout this process. So yeah, let's get into this, shall we? So, first, we need to examine Japan's take on criminal justice, because there's a massive difference between how it and America handle situations, which reflects in the media that we create. So, America's conviction rate, according to the United States Attorney's report for the year of 2012, was 85%. Meanwhile, if we look over at Japan, we're going to see a rate that's closer to 99% from what I found in my research. Now, this is a drastic increase up, and we can see this represented in the past. Every country has, how do I put this? Every country has its own values that it brings up from its infancy. In America, for example, we really emphasize freedom of speech as a value. And a lot of the conflicts going on in America today reflect that, because freedom of speech is something that winds up getting threatened when we're getting these big corporations to start taking over. Justice is something that Japan's had going on since the days of the samurai and the Sengoku period. And I think it's a notable thing to tackle for this, because every culture has its own take on justice, you know? And this article that I found from John O'Haley is called "Sheathing the Sword of Justice in Japan," and it was an essay about law without sanctions, and it tied things back all the way to the Sengoku period, and how the code of the samurai reflected what would be seen in the modern day. Another thing that's going on in Japan is we need to going into my research in my class that I've taken, that this is a presentation for, Making Meaning in Culture. We talked about the film 5 centimeters per second and how animes had a major role in shaping how Japan's been seen by the outside world, because it's one of those exports. Like anime and video games, I would argue, are the Japanese exports that have been seen the most in America and represent how we see them so often. We talk a lot about Nintendo and how it's on the top of its game. The Wii was one of the best selling consoles ever, and so is the Switch, which is from Japan as a country. But anime is the other major export, as it's been growing within the West for many years now, and its culture is taken out. Another thing that'll be important for the discussion is the concept of NEETs in Japan and how it's a rising thing for them as the epidemic, or as a thing. And I think the discussion of NEETs is an interesting thing because of how differently it's handled in America compared to in Japan. Japan's home structures are much more, you're living at home for a longer period of time normally. Meanwhile, in America, you're expected to be out of the house by the time you're graduating college, when that certainly isn't the case at a lot of points in people's lives, even though parents sometimes would want that to be. And we've been seeing the disenfranchised parasite singles starting to become a thing more in Japan as culture's been moving onwards. But so aside from these points, let's actually analyze Death Note now, because now that we have these ground pieces of source material, we should examine how this work tackles the concepts of justice. Now, let's first of all explain what Death Note is. Death Note was started out as a manga that was released in Shonen Jump, the biggest manga magazine in Japan, between 2003 and 2006. It was adapted into an anime that was broadcast in Japan between 2006 and 2007, and then the anime got transferred right over to America from 2007 to 2008. Now, this is a sign of something being on kind of the fast track for success. After it ended in one form, it was immediately broadcast. So it was cultural, and it's been culturally relevant for far longer. They've had 4 movies in Japan based on the work, as well as an American live action remake that was bad. They also got a musical that was based on the manga and anime. And then there's been several spin-off chapters of the manga released, including one as late as I think 2020 that featured Death Note's version of Donald Trump, because they were setting it with the actual U.S. president. It's a weird time. But so the premise of Death Note and why it appeals to justice so much is the Shinigami Ryu drops a Death Note, an object that if you write someone's name down, they die. And the high school honor student named Light Yagami picks the notebook up and after experimenting with it first, decides that he's going to use it to rid the world of all criminals and become the god of the new world himself, ultimately taking his stance on justice that he's the right person for this godliness. But the conflict, though, comes down. So the 2 central characters to the entire narrative are Light Yagami and L. Light's an egotist whose justice is in his own image, as he wants to push the world better for himself. The neat thing comes back in that it's not really examined in show, but he examines that once he's done dealing with the criminals, he's going to be dealing with those who aren't doing anything for society, and clean it that way and make it a more advanced and progressive society on doing things more than sitting around. There, this also comes back to the Japanese work ethic thing that was mentioned with the samurai. Meanwhile, the person who he goes into conflict with for the work is a private detective known as L. L is hired by the Japanese police to take charge of the Kira investigation after he's had several successes, and these 2 conflict on trying not to get caught by the other one, Light, so he doesn't go to jail, and L, so he's not killed, is what drives the series, with a bunch of other variables entering throughout the course of the 37 episodes that it goes through. I think one thing that's so fascinating about this is their foilness. Light, while being technically the villain of the show, I think he's a villain protagonist. And being a bad person himself, is so obsessed with justice. Meanwhile, L couldn't care less about justice and cares way more about the game that goes on within it. So these two's conflict is just headfirst the big thing within Death Note. I put down some quotes to understand them, and I think of this quote, for one, examines Light's ego being such a centric piece for Death Note as media. Because when you think you're the only one who can create a world, he basically uses this and takes advantage of this chance and brings it on for himself. It's a selfishness of his ego, and it examines exactly what he's about, because while he's for justice, it turns out to fall under the stress, especially when you compare it to other more just characters that we're going to get into. Meanwhile, L, a quote for him, I think this examines his not really caring too much about ethics aside from the lying thing, because it's harder for him in his game. Both of them are egotistical, but this quote about lying monsters and how in Lying and Thieves just examine him trying to get the most that he can out of Kira, or Light in this case, because this conflict's right at the center of the show. But so I think when you're examining justice within Death Note, you need to examine other characters about how they play their roles in the story too. So I'm gonna shine particular light on Soichiro Yagami and Teru Mikami. Soichiro Yagami was the chief of police in Japan, and so he takes the lead on the Kira investigation. Now, this lead that he takes is conflicted by the fact that Light's his son, and he doesn't know that Light is Kira, so he's trying to get things done within the law system, because he's a just and genuinely a good person. He's the one good person in the cast. Meanwhile, I think Mikami is of interest because he is on Light's side for the latter half of the show, and he represents someone who's so devoted to Kira and can only see the black and white of things of justice. Because justice, when you take it to an extremity, becomes a black and white situation. And Death Note examines justice when it's at its extremities instead of when it's in its subtleness. Soichiro goes through the law, and that's where he gets his justice thing, wanting to stop criminals. That way, characters like Mikami and Light go beyond the law. This is a quote from Mikami, I think, that really reflects his black and white nature as how he views things. And I think within this viewpoint of his, it's important to just understand how blind he is. He's a lawyer, also. Meanwhile, there's a character like Soichiro Yakami, who this, I think, reflects that his reliance on laws is because it's the best system that they have. Killing people is out of the question for him as a character, as a character trait, and he's not for it at all. I think these characters all examine justice in like various different ways and reflect different flavors of how Japan as a society is at conflict with itself. Because when you think about it, every country's core codes that go in define it. There's always going to be people who disagree with it. There's always going to be people who are all for it. And that's the way that we kind of work things into. So this kind of concludes the main portion of this. If you guys have any questions or anything, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And yeah, I just think that this is a piece of media that's really fascinating to go through on how it views justice and the system as a whole. And I also think that when we examine a piece of culture like Death Note, we examine a microcosm of the exact years that it was coming out. You hear a lot of like the 2003 beliefs that were going around in the world post turn of the millennium. So these are a lot of the sources that I used to make this presentation and this essay. And for those of you who have watched this and gotten to the end, thank you so much for being here. I've appreciated it, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your days. I hope this could shine a new light on these topics for you guys. So yeah, enjoy.